I'm Dr. Fahmida Suleiman, Rom Curator of Islamic Art and Culture, and I'm delighted you could join us today for Rom Connects program, produced in collaboration with the Toronto Renaissance and Reformation Colloquium and its conference on Masculinities in the Premodern World, Continuities, Change, and Contradictions. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Rom sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. I encourage you to submit your thoughts and questions via the chat feature during the program, and we will attempt to answer as many as we can at the end of the lecture. We would like to thank Toronto Renaissance and Reformation Colloquium for partnering with us to produce this lecture as part of the ROM's public programming schedule. And now, I would like to hand over to Dr. Conrad Eisenbichler of the University of Toronto to introduce today's talk and speaker.
Thank you very much. It is my special pleasure for me to introduce to you a scholar whose work I have admired, not just for years, but for decades. Australia-born and trained, Professor Patricia Simons is one of the leading figures in the English-speaking world in the field of art history and in the art historical approaches to sex and gender studies. After receiving her doctorate from the University of Melbourne, where she also began her teaching career, Professor Simons taught for a few years at the University of Sydney before moving permanently to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, where she is now Professor Emeritus in the History of Art and Women's Studies. Professor Simons enjoys a worldwide reputation as a specialist in the art of Renaissance Europe, and especially the arts of Italy, France, and the Netherlands. Since the 1990s, she has been a leader in emerging discourses on the representation of gender and sexuality in European art. She is also a leader in interdisciplinary research on materiality, visuality, and material culture. Her groundbreaking books have been published by the Cambridge University Press and by the Clarendon Press at Oxford, while her many articles have appeared in anthologies and top-rated peer-reviewed journals such as Art History, Renaissance Quarterly, and Renaissance Studies. In these books and articles, Professor Simons has explored such issues as portraiture as a mode of fictive representation, medical discourse in relation to visual culture, the representation and reception of female and male homoeroticism, the visual dynamics of secrecy and of scandal, and the public and the theatrical use of the Christ child figures. Her books and articles are marked by a combination of rigor and innovation, as well as by an amazing breadth of visual and material culture, from badges to maiolica, from anatomical illustrations to erotic prints, from life-size sculpture to canonical oil paintings and frescoes. Though recently retired from her position at the University of Michigan, Professor Simons remains very active. Just this year, she was elected an honorary professional fellow at her alma mater, the University of Melbourne, and she continues to carry out groundbreaking research. Her latest projects include a large open access Google Doc that is a global bibliography on pre-modern women artists and patrons. And she is working on a book-length analysis of the visual and cultural history of beards as core markers of various masculinities in early modern Europe, including a consideration of racial and ethnic differences. It is on this topic of beards, in fact, that she will speak to us this evening. So please welcome with me Professor Simons and her talk on marked differences, the beard in Renaissance Europe.
Thank you very much, Conrad. And I'm very grateful to Conrad and to, do we have the screen now coming up? I'm sorry, let me just make sure we're getting everything properly here. You can see the screen with the PowerPoint. There we go. I'm very grateful to everyone who's worked so hard to get this conference together, particularly to Conrad Eisenbichler and Jacqueline Murray for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference on masculinities in the pre-modern world, organised by the Toronto Renaissance and Reformation Colloquium, and also to the Royal Ontario Museum, especially Erin Carr and Fahmida Suleiman, for deciding to join forces and open this plenary address to a wider audience. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us from far and wide in a variety of time zones and across borders that are in many cases closed. May our virtual crossing of boundaries augur well for our intellectual journey. Now, in keeping with the conference title of Masculinities, plural rather than masculinity, tonight I'm going to focus on significant differences in men's facial hair during the Renaissance. In medical, legal, and social terms, the ability to grow a beard was considered a distinctive, exclusive marker of the male adult reproductive body. But that normative structure did not always mean that men did not shave. There were shifts in the practice over time. On the whole, men shaved in the 15th century, but began to grow beards by the second decade of the 16th century. And that habit was maintained until facial hair was replaced by false, sometimes ludicrously abundant wigs in the late 17th century. As you can see in the bust of Lorenzo de' Medici on the far left there, stubble or morning shadow was sometimes subtly represented in 15th century portraits in order to assert the sitter's full masculine virility and identity. But for a variety of reasons, groomed beards became fashionable for several centuries. Partly, this visual shift in self-representation was due to the vagaries of fashion, which usually cycle back and forth. However, a fashionable trend is more about popularity than change. That is, it is a description of a vogue. It's not the same as an analytical explanation of its initial cause and subsequent acceptance. Studies that focus on the different styles of beards, this is also done, as you can see here, with contemporary beards, similarly reduce the mode to no more than personal taste, and they neglect social meanings. Instead, I argue differences in facial hair were not about styles for their own sake and did not merely indicate the wearer's choice or character, which are modern superficial criteria about fashion. Today and yesteryear, facial hair and its meaning depend on such factors as genetics and physiology, health, age, wealth, origin, the pressure of ethnic and national norms, religion, times, occupation, status, or desirability and sexuality. For example, in this etching of the head of an Ottoman, his geographical origin, ethnic and religious difference, and visual interest are immediately apparent by means of his turban and his mustache. According to inscriptions, the artist observed this Turkish man firsthand in London in 1637, and that memory resulted in the print produced 8 years later. It is not a portrait of an anonymous man, however, but part of a series of heads and ethnic types, including this presentation of a 23-year-old Native American that was also based on the artist's eyewitness experience of a captive from Virginia put on display in Amsterdam and Antwerp. In the latter case, alongside the ornamentation he bears of necklace, earrings, headband, and facial markings, shaving is a key feature. Whether or not the young man needed to shave his face, a sharp implement has been used to shave much of his head, producing a memorable image that Holler recorded for a broad print-buying clientele. But I want to stress, by the way, that in these and all the portraits I will discuss, what is being analysed here is appearance rather than actuality. What personal particulars the artist really saw can never be known for sure. For example, how utterly shaved was that Native American's head after he had spent at least several weeks away from his homeland and its tools. And the Ottoman gentleman may have had more of a beard, but Holler reduced the facial hair just to the typical moustache because he was meeting viewers' expectations and following convention. So I'm going to be talking about visual choices made for public and often widely disseminated images that appeared plausible and thus did accord with overall patterns or betray departures from convention. As an art historian, I am looking for patterns and exceptions rather than claiming that the art is no more than a straightforward reflection of actual appearances. Now, distinctly Turkish features were already well known to Europeans because what we now call the handlebar moustache has come to be a stereotypical marker of Ottomans. In particular, a certain representation of the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, had spread via prints, first issued in 1526, and European paintings thereafter on the basis of those prints. He's sometimes shown with a beard too, but the striking moustache was the stock attribute of a Turk, readily recognizable as though the turban and the moustache sufficiently indicated any Ottoman for European viewers. In fact, the distinctive fashioning had already been observed in the later 15th century, possibly in lost drawings made by the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini during his visit to Istanbul in 1480, and certainly preserved here in drawings produced by the German artist Albrecht Dürer when he visited Venice in the mid-1490s. So over several centuries, European artists and their audience thought they knew that turbans, when depicted in conjunction with the extravagant handlebar moustache, visually documented an entire empire. Thus, to signify the defeat by the European Habsburg Empire of the Ottoman army at the decisive Battle of Lepanto in 1571, Titian personified the vanquished enemy in the form of a nearly naked warrior, his clothing stripped from his body, his turban fallen from his head, yet still he sports the distinct moustache. On the other hand, this impression is of uniform difference between Europeans and Ottomans was wrong. Many Ottomans wore a full beard as well as the wide, thick moustache, or in some cases, inhabitants of the empire were beardless. As you see, there was a third figure in Dürer's drawing, a black African attendant, either enslaved or free, standing at a respectful distance, wearing a turban but simpler garb, and without any facial hair, as though he is less of a virile man and possibly a eunuch. That absence of facial hair puzzled a later artist whose woodcut from the drawing turned the figure into a much younger but still black man of an age before facial hair was expected. In both drawing and woodcut, the lack of visible facial hair adds to the impression of subservience and marked difference. Medical thinking in both the Arabic and ancient Greek and Roman traditions, and each of which were influential in European culture at the time, regarded facial hair as emblematic of masculine and muscular vigor. Medically, legally, and socially, the onset of a beard was believed to signal a man's ability to reproduce. And as one sees on the left, in the detail of the object on the right, a military commander of Roman antiquity is depicted here on a maiolica plate from the Rom collection. We have a lengthy beard denoting the age, wisdom, seniority, and virility of men of authority. Or in a religious context, long beards similarly mark venerable men. saints and martyrs in the case of this icon from the Rom collection, and other wise men and prophets were also endowed with the long, usually hoary beard, connoting august, learned personages of considerable experience. The only hairless faces in this icon are those of the Soul Woman, the Virgin Mary, two secular men with halos who were holy rulers, and lastly, various angels, sexless creatures, according to theologians, conventionally pictured by artists as androgynous figures approximating beardless and adolescent youths. Inherited from the image of ancient Greek philosophers, the lengthy beard of priests and sanctified figures in the Byzantine and then Greek Orthodox Church created a divide that was too far to cross when church councils met to consider the matter of union between East and West. One Greek visitor, Simeon, the Archbishop of Thessalonica, was dismayed by the deceptive, elaborate attempts at realism in the religious plays he saw in Italy, including the fact that because, quote, Latins, that is, members of the Catholic Church, because they shaved for the performances, they had to don fake beards of blonde hair in order to simulate the appearance of authoritative figures like God the Father. So this archbishop opined that shaving was a feminizing and, quote, against the laws of nature, whereas his church's habit of growing long beards and hair was, quote, to honor nature and obey God's will. Later in the 15th century, when the Greek churchman Basilios Bessarion, who had switched allegiances and was made a cardinal in the Latin Church at the end of 1439, when he became a possible candidate for the papacy in 1455, objections included the fact that he had kept his Greek beard, taken as a sign of incomplete conversion. We have a contemporary account of his appearance, Gentile Bellini's painting commissioned around 1472 for the door of the tabernacle housing his precious gift to a Venetian confraternity. Unlike the clean-shaven faces and closely cropped heads of two younger local members of the confraternity, the cardinal is distinguished by a grey, wavy and carefully groomed beard that extends well beyond his chin, covers his upper lip and all of the lower cheeks. Presenting the confraternity members in full face, but Bessarion in profile, signifies that he is the donor, painted in the typical side view of the key devotee who has commissioned a painting. But the profile against a dark background and his sombre black clothing may also indicate that the portrait is posthumous, for he died in November 1472. Admired as a scholar, around 1476, several years after he had died, he was one of the few contemporaries honoured by inclusion in the famous men's cycle of panels painted for Duke Federico de Montefeltro's studiolo in Urbino. That depiction in three-quarter view probably derives from Bellini's panel or preparatory drawings for it, and chooses to show a more slightly forked, whiter and less neatly trimmed beard, following more closely the conventional type of long-bearded, revered philosopher. And most of the ancient men in this Urbino cycle, including Moses, Hippocrates, Plato, and Aristotle, are all pictured with beards, but Bessarion is the only bearded Christian. In life, as in death, his iconographic attribute was considered by some to be the essence of the man. According to an eyewitness report by Aeneas Piccolomini, who was later Pope Pius II, Bessarion's chance to be elected to the papacy in 1455 was derailed by the insidious murmurings of Alain, Cardinal of Avignon. The Frenchman went around the room, whispering in one ear, then the other. So we'll give the Latin Church to a Greek Pope, will we? We'll put a neophyte at the head of the book? Bessarion hasn't even shaved his beard and he's going to be our head. How do we know his conversion is sincere? I and those who think with me will never accept a Greek as Pope. Now, notably, his rhetorical emphasis on caput, head, More than once is the symbolic sense of head of the church, but it further drew attention to the literal as well as emblematic otherness of Bessarion's visage. The story fits the fierce debates of the time regarding reintegration, and Alain's clever ploy relied on long-standing beliefs that beards were outward signs of inner convictions. Far from merely exotic fashion, Greek beards could be read as vital political and religious signs. Such experiences and images of foreign beards generated awareness of facial hair as a cultural rather than merely personal phenomenon, signifying allegiance, faith, and wisdom. They also demonstrated that beards could encapsulate virility and virtue, an idea that came to fruition in the 16th century. So diverse religions disagreed about facial hair. For different reasons, adult male Jews, Muslims, and members of the Greek church, much of the Mediterranean, were all bearded. But considerable historical variation characterized rules regarding the Latin church. In the New Testament, St. Paul derided long hair as shamefully effeminate on men, while praising it as a glory on women, acting like a veil, and he resorted to natura, to nature, as the reason for the difference. He did not specifically opine on beards, though. He was more talking about head hair, whereas some other early church fathers argued for the Greek value of manly beards against Roman practices of what was considered effeminate shaving and depilation. The beard was the crucial sign of a man, Clement of Alexandria wrote in the last decade of the 2nd century, quote, the badge of a man which shows him unmistakably to be a man, and the symbol of manhood. And the Latin authority, St. Augustine, very much echoed the same thought, saying that by definition, a man is bearded, barbatus homo est. In the 5th century Latin canon, accredited to a church council at Carthage, it laid down a simple rule that, quote, clerics neither grow their hair nor shave their beards. But sometime before the 9th century, the wording was changed to the opposite meaning, so that short hair was to be accompanied by facial shaving. That disavowal of hirsuteness remained the general rule for centuries, though it was not always followed in practice. Temporary beards were allowed for many decades and centuries, at times according to fasting, mourning, or penance practices, for example. And also some high officials, including popes, occasionally adopted permanent beards, probably according to secular practice at the time, especially in order to appear as august and powerful as secular kings. Beards were also more permissible in cases of older age and senior rank. The core purpose of regulating facial hair among the Latin clergy was either to distinguish certain clerical groups like monks from the laity, or to allow them to be more integrated, which is more often the case for priests. When in the 16th century, secular men in Western Europe were almost universally bearded, the Catholic Church dithered with its precepts. The 5th century canon against shaving was first printed in 1538, but the crucial word radat, shave, was dropped in the volume's 2nd edition of 1551. And that mid-16th century return to disallowing clerical beards when most secular men was growing them nevertheless swam against the tide. Pope Clement VII had made beards optional for all priests in January 1531. And of course, in the meantime, the Protestant Reformation had introduced a radically different religious perspective. One of the ways in which leading reformers distinguished themselves from Catholics was to adopt the long beard that signified wise, venerable elders. Numerous propaganda images, I'm showing you just a few, showed them gathered around a table, most of them bearded, but always with the very notable exception in the center of their founder, Martin Luther. So one interesting question is, why did Martin Luther continue to shave? Only once, due to particular circumstances, was he represented with a beard. And this exception proved the rule, for his disguise as Junker George, as a kind of a local knight, in 1521 was about deception and hiding from certain Catholic authorities at the time, until numerous images had to be circulated of whiskered Luther in order to dispel rumours of his death. And thereafter, his clean-shaven face implied that he was unafraid, open and independent of political machinations. His anachronistic visage was also distinctive, separating him out from that table at from the crowd at that figurative table. Another reason for his choice, I suspect, was that as a former Augustinian monk who bore the tonsure, Luther was aware of fervent arguments against facial hair. Many Catholics believed that beards marked men as akin to uncontrolled, lusty, hairy goats, whereas shaving was a visible sign of self-management and of a more purified, sexless state, closer to angels. For instance, the Benedictine chronicler of English history, Odoric Vitalis, in the early 12th century, who explicitly explained that long beards were normally the sign of penitents, prisoners and pilgrims, because they, quote, publicly proclaimed their condition of penance or captivity or pilgrimage. And these three roles continued to be marked by conspicuous beards in the visual culture of early modern Europe. All were rueful, humbling signs of sin like hair being expelled from the body by acts of penitence, pilgrimage, or punishment. But as he went on to say, Odoric, those who in the sight of God are bristling with sins and unkempt within may walk outwardly bristling and unshorn before men, and proclaim by their outward disgrace the baseness of the inner man. Long beards give them the look of he-goats, whose filthy viciousness is shamefully imitated by the degradations of fornicators and sodomites, and they are rightly abominated by decent men for the foulness of their vile lusts. Pretty clear what he thought. Now, Luther's shaved countenance avowed very much that he was unlike those stinking goats and lusty satyrs, thus obstructing any potential polemic that could be cast against him for leaving the Augustinian order and marrying. At the time, a certain length of long, messy beard was described as goat-like. Here you see two of them in French and Italian dictionaries, or rather, thank goodness for our purposes, they translated in both cases into English. That we have a filthy great or goat-like beard, or a grim, shagged, goatish beard, also fraud, guile, or cheating was connoted by the word. So beards could be regarded as deceitful disguises, precisely as Luther knew, but that's an issue I don't have time to discuss this evening. And so notably, the dishevelled beard continues to connote belligerent, untrammeled masculinity. Such unrestrained, hyper-masculine growths remind me of the unkempt beards proudly worn by many aggressive, burly men on the terrorist far right, including in the state of Michigan, where I currently reside, and where a small band of highly armed men tried to occupy the state legislature back in April. All 13 men charged just last month in October with conspiring to kidnap the governor were bearded. You see their mugshots there on the left. The mugshots of two of them may make them appear not to be bearded because they had blonde hair that doesn't come up very much in this small scale, but they're all bearded there. And notably, you see in the photograph on the other side, most military and police forces instead insist on the extreme cropping of hair on the face and head, continuing the assumption that virtue and self-control are marked by shaving. Artists depicting Luther chose much subtler ways to remind viewers of his regulated but powerful masculinity, including endowing him with monumental size and occasionally indicating stubble. Hans Baldung Grien's woodcut on the left here of Luther as an inspired monk adds the naturalistic touch of stubble, which you see a little bit on his head as well as on his face, because in fact tonsuring of the head and shaving of the face in the cloister only took part every several weeks 3-4 weeks quite often, and the clean-shaven, smooth faces seen in countless images and portraits of monks and friars are idealizations of them in their most purified, freshly shaven form. Combining the everyday detail of stubble with the blessing of the holy dove above, which creates a halo-like aura around Luther, cleverly here creates the visual impression that this is indeed a lifelike representation of what is nevertheless a truly divinely sanctioned theologian. St. Francis was a religious figure with a variable countenance, fully tonsured and shaved in some images, such as this Maiolica plate in the Rom collection, but shown as an ascetic bearded hermit in the earliest known representation of him, probably painted during his lifetime. To some extent, the variation in his iconography pointed to divisions within the Franciscan order, but it was also due to the degree to which an artist's close observation of the actual effect of tonsure was deemed important. When freshly tonsured and shaved, the man not only had what was described as a crown or a circle of bare scalp, but also a fully bearded face and hair shaved well above the ears. During the 15th century, as you see on the right, many secular men adopted the half tonsure, omitting the crown, but ensuring that they were portrayed with that high razor shave that extended above the ears. Thereby, their outward appearance declared that they were upright citizens who followed monastic exemplars in their virtuous piety. When Florence was in the grip of the extreme religious reformer Girolamo Savonarola during the 1490s, one of his supporters described the positive effect he had on the city's youths, whose turn from vices like gambling and lascivious poetry was evident in their removal of codpieces and their adoption of new haircuts. They disavowed the new era fashion for longer hair, seen on the left here in 2 Florentine portraits of the same time, and instead the Savonarolan followers were seen, quote, with their hair cut short up above the ear. So they were returning to an older, strict style of shaving, publicly, visibly declaring their newfound purification by way of haircuts that were akin to those of the friars who were mobilizing them. Shaved faces of any style that were displayed in 15th century portraits demonstrated masculinity that was contained, controlled, normative, honourable, and seemingly asexual. But close inspection reveals many cases in which stubble was painstakingly rendered, while in the case, white stubble in the case of old men, who were by that means bestowed with ongoing vigour and authority, and whose portraits are given a subtle, compelling texture and naturalistic presence, even if, as in the case of the portrait you see here on the right, the family ancestor was actually already dead. In other cases, dark stubble proclaims that the sitter is very much alive, with a sexual, virile nature, even cheeky willingness to stretch the limits of convention, in the case of Antonello da Messina's subject. Most often, facial hair is barely evident, emerging above the lips and sometimes on the chin, as we see in Dürer's self-portrait of 1493, painted when he was aged 22. He holds a plant that traditionally connoted courtship, and this self-presentation is plausibly related to his marriage that occurred less than a year later. I would argue that his budding facial hair is a vital aspect, proclaiming that he is now of legal age to marry, capable of reproduction and of offering complete sexual pleasure. We need to remember, by the way, that beards came in much later than they tend to now, often in the early 20s. Rembrandt, for instance, was 23 when the first signs of his facial hair were recorded. So, different modes of facial hair conveyed political, imperial, sexual, and religious notions of masculinity according to various factors, including ethnicity and race, occupation, age, and faith. Such customs were neither just personal or simply fashion trends of no significance, and they shifted over the decades. In what time remains, I don't know if I've just been... I will briefly sketch out why beards were understood as such fundamental and natural declarations of masculinity. and then consider the question of why they became normative from the early 16th century. In the 1490s, relaying the succinct words of a Greek peasant who was well aware of bearded men in his Orthodox church, the Venetian surgeon Alessandro Benedetti noted that the beard, quote, is contained in the testicles. That is, the production of reproductive semen was thought to be directly related to the male body's ability to produce hair. He reported the standard chronology. Pubic hair grows first, then the hair in the armpits, and lastly the beard, meaning that only with the advent of facial hair is the transition to male adulthood complete. The fundamental law code of the Holy Roman Empire gave legal weight to the medical precept, decreeing that a man came of legal age only once he grew hair in all three areas of his body. Remember, it was common for facial hair to emerge only when a man was in his early 20s. Poetry in ancient Greek, Latin, Arabic, and various vernaculars proclaimed of the youth's advent from homoeroticized appeal to marriageable status once hair began to appear on the beloved's face. And remember, that meant often that the beloved was turning into his early 20s. Already by the last decades of the 15th century and the early years of the 16th century, some men flaunted social expectations about shaving. One such example was an Italian man accused of impotence, who subsequently issued a medal portraying him with a heavy beard and thick mane of hair. Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro and an illegitimate member of the powerful Milanese ruling family, faces right with a fierce gaze, a stern set to his mouth. Rivulets of long curling hair run down from his head, and the beard is a thriving mass of curls extending high up the cheeks and 2 centimetres or so below the jaw. The medal emphatically presents a determined hirsute soldier clad in armour and mail. A detailed inscription runs around the rim. Giovanni Sforza, son of Costanzo, Lord of Pesaro, aged 37, 1503. The medal commemorates his retaking of the city after a hiatus under Cesare Borgia during the years 1501-03. A restoration emphasised on the reverse, which bears the inscription, "Received home," and a broken yoke, which means it's symbolising victory over Borgia's heavy yoke-like rule. Coins first struck in April 1498 display a similar beard, and his later medal here slightly changes that design. Probably, however, both were produced in the mint of Pesaro. It was unusually early for a European man's visage to be represented with such a full beard, and it may primarily indicate that this condottiere was a tough soldier. But the facial distinction also answers rumours about impotence that had circulated since at least early 1497. After his first wife died, in 1492, Giovanni had married by proxy the 13-year-old Lucrezia Borgia, illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI, though the marriage was not celebrated until June 1493. However, the ambitious Pope soon wanted to use his illegitimate daughter Lucrezia to forge more prestigious political ties, and he pressured Giovanni to admit to impotence so that the marriage could be dissolved. Well, after much resistance from Giovanni, lasting most of the year, the union was annulled in December 1497. A considerable dowry was also at issue, but his unwillingness chiefly stemmed from concerns about his masculine honour. In the end, Lucrezia's statement that she did not know whether their marriage had been consummated moderated the outright charge of impotence against Giovanni, but the implication was damning. Lucrezia officially remained a virgin and was able to remarry more prestigiously, whereas his virility and honour were impugned. Coins and medals bearing images of his bearded face, first issued only 4 months after that annulment, resoundingly publicised the man's hirsute vitality and virility. Easy to disseminate, relatively small, relatively cheap to produce, they were capable of spreading the assertive message far abroad, responding to scandalous gossip regarding the notorious Borgia Pope, his daughter, and a princeling from the powerful Sforza clan. Within months of Alexander VI's death in August 1503, Giovanni was back in charge of Pesaro. The medal announced the renewal, presenting him as a strong soldier, a patriotic ruler, and virile man. But within a decade of Sforza's countenance, that would have looked less exceptional because more and more men were exhibiting full beards. Besides the generic dismissive explanation that the degree of shaving simply cycled in and out of fashion, a second explanation for such a widespread swing toward bearded countenance is that an important ruler adopted the fashion. Here you're looking at Francis I of France, for example, and thereafter so did his courtiers, and then the habit quickly spread. Now that account resorts once more to an individual element, which can have its problems, though there is an acknowledgement of power here, very much about, from the hierarchy spreading throughout the court. But it too tends to be descriptive and begs the question as to why that ruler changed in the first place and why his new practice became so widespread. Notably, this early portrait of the youth was painted around the very time that he married in May 1514, and he became king the 1st of January 1515. So I think that, as with Dürer and many others, this first portrait of Francis is an instance of an unnoticed trend, that commissioning of portraits that proclaim that young men are now marriageable because their incipient facial hair demonstrates their physiological status as new adults who could father children, were sexually capable and independent legally and financially. Facial hair was thus a very charged communicative assertion of masculine authority, social standing, and sexual potency. So this portrait of Francis is in that vein, though the artist shows the beard beginning to fill out at the chin, and later portraits of the king show a thicker, darker beard, possibly in later years augmented with hair dye. So the question is not why did a man grow his beard, but why did he keep it and groom it? Francis I, whose proud display of the beard balanced his oversized nose, was one of several younger rulers of the earlier 16th century who permanently adopted a beard. They were competing with each other in their overt declaration of masculine prowess and power. In some cases, including Cosimo I de' Medici and Habsburgian Emperor Charles V, their facial hair was developed with quite some difficulty. Thin, patchy, and irregular, though it depended on the artist's interest in veracity, Cosimo's beard was augmented by frequent depiction in hefty armour. And although Charles's beard is usually explained as a device to disguise his very jutting Habsburg jaw, the family was proud of its distinctive brand, as it were, which connoted to them strength and unity. Indeed, the projecting points of his beard exaggerated the genetic deformity and affirmed his Habsburg lineage. His reasons for cultivating a beard were again public more than personal, involving the avowal of power. At the age of 16, he ascended to the throne of Spain, and when aged 19, he became Holy Roman Emperor. And also he was interested in virility and its declaration, of course. He was engaged at the age of 25, once he became keen to father children and continue the dynasty. So you see here overall that there's a shift happening in the 1490s in terms of when rulers even first came to their title, and at the same time when they would begin to marry at much younger ages than had been happening in the 15th century. Overall, while the adoption of beards by rulers was widely known and possibly influential in the early decades of the 16th century, that practice was nevertheless coterminous with the widespread growth of facial hair at the time. So no one man was a trendsetter. What is notable that we have this cluster of 4 soon bearded rulers: Henry VIII in England, Francis I in France, Suleiman the Magnificent in the Ottoman Empire, and Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, were all born on within the year 1500, within a decade of each other. And they all became rulers at a relatively young age and married around the same time. These men adopted permanent beards in order to assert their adulthood, their authority, and their virility at a time when many lesser men were also ceasing to shave. And here's another explanation, published 5 years ago. Why the shift to beards? What propelled the change in fashion? What it was, according to this author, was insecurity. The feeling on the part of so many Italians belonging to the elite or aspiring to be part of it that despite all the colossal capital and urban planning and civic pride, Italy was as weak and vulnerable as ever. However, on a factual basis alone, there are many problems with this claim. Invasions of the Italian peninsula by French forces began in the 1490s, for instance, and beards did not instantly become, or even for a decade or more, become the common habit. And the Kingdom of Naples fell to Spain in 1503, several years or even decades before the wearing of beards became widespread. And the chronological problem is matched by a geographical one. Beards were neither confined to Italy nor started there. More fundamentally, the association of beards with a crisis in masculinity participates in a trend in historical as well as contemporary studies to situate and explain masculinity in relation to anxiety and crisis. But that is about rhetoric rather than reality. Patriarchy is alive and well, yet early modern studies perpetuated for some time the faulty explanation. In 2010, the first page of the introduction to a volume on the poetics of masculinity in early modern Italy and Spain noted, quote, the anxieties of early modern Italian and Spanish men in the context of Renaissance social normativizing forces. And the essay went on to use words like vulnerabilities, anxiety, failure, feminization, upheavals, unrest, decline, effeminized, weak, risk, vulnerable, loss, and uncertainty. The cover image, by the way, is a painting of 1518-20 that shows 2 bearded men, including Raphael's self-portrait on the left, locked in a relationship of support, admiration, and friendship. There's no crisis in sight. Recent studies have begun to analyse the assumptions and flaws in notions that link masculinity with crisis. The problematic, inadequate model reinforces the practices of masculinity rather than analyses them. My objections include the fact that only male members of a patriarchy are allowed to feel anxious in the model, not women. So it is itself gendered and reinscribes standard ideas about masculinity. Like the labours of Hercules, which were many, patriarchal masculinity always had to find another foe, another problem against which to assert its ongoing, even increasing strength and power. The rhetoric and responses serve only to buttress whichever group claims to discern a crisis. When investigated, many of these crises of the 16th century are about age, authority, and power in an increasingly imperial hierarchical period. So such supposed emergencies and insecurities are about political and social shifts more than psychic ones. To the extent that there were either an individual or communal response of anxiety, it came after and in tandem with the increasing narrowing of power. Whereas crisis might be considered a sufficient explanation, I find it merely an after effect and an artificial and rhetorical construct. If 16th century beards are responding to crisis, then when do we ever see masculinity in repose, at ease, and comfortable with itself? Are shaved faces necessarily blithe, happy, and crisis-free? How anxious and crisis-ridden was Cosimo de' Medici if he allowed his scrappy beard to be permanently seen everywhere? Put another way, when will a certain type of masculinity not need to make itself great again? A confluence of numerous factors helps to explain the onset of what became, for a century or so, the conventional practice of not shaving. Awareness of and by a new, younger generation of leaders in charge of territories with increased imperial might. The importance of dynastic succession centered more on genetic offspring than adoption or overthrow, especially by the Habsburgs, ensuring stable, centralized, and longer-lived regimes. Growing knowledge by other men, too, of the medical, social, and sexual import of the age of maturity. The rise in militarized status. More travel and trade across the Mediterranean, forging a degree of integration as well as competition. Claims by different faiths to be virile and venerable. The understanding that beards signified healthy male bodies that were potent and syphilis-free. Syphilis was a disease that first became noticeable around 1495 in Europe. And another factor was a loosening of sexual restrictions among the upper class, and thus a greater interest in sexual pleasure. In keeping with ideas about goatish beards, the ancient Greek natural philosopher Aristotle believed that, quote, men that are hairy are more prone to sexual intercourse and have more semen than men that are smooth. And in 1610, the physician Jacques Ferrand, following on in very much the same tradition, opined that our ladies hate men with scant beards, not only because they are frequently cold and sexually feeble, but also because they, like eunuchs, are inclined to cruelty and cheating. The cultivation of beards suited a greater focus on the eroticization and virility of classicized, powerful male bodies. About to marry and with facial hair starting to grow, in 1538, Cosimo de' Medici was portrayed by Bronzino as Orpheus, seductively charming the animals. About a decade earlier, Giulio Romano's frescoes in the pleasure palace of Duke Federico Gonzaga of Mantua included an image of genitally aroused Jupiter about to adulterously father Alexander the Great with the king of Macedonia's wife, and the supreme god Jupiter there bears some resemblance to Duke Federico. In the 1550s, Emperor Charles V, now in his 50s, was represented by Leone Leoni as an alternatively armored and classically nude conqueror. This very sculpture could be clad with armor, or as we see here, the armor taken off to reveal this very active, athletic body. So he is a conqueror here, victoriously subjugating the figure below him of chained fury, and thereby sustaining order and peace. In each case, legendary personas join with Atlantica musculature and grandeur, further enhanced by their manly beards. The same is true of Bronzino's portrait of Andrea Doria, Habsburgian admiral from Genoa, pictured in command of the seas like the semi-naked god Neptune. One crucial element of the imposing effect is that long beard. Similar to what is seen in other representations of ancient idealized leaders and mature divinities. His beard retains some dark color amidst the silvery grey tones, and the tendrils curve in seemingly continuous motion, visually affirming the sense of an energetic body and alert mind. However, we have an earlier impression of the man, recorded around 1529 by the eyewitness Christoph Wieditz, a German artist. He saw the beard very differently, as a longer, undifferentiated mass of mostly white with just a few touches of grey. And that German drawing is likely to be more accurate, to the extent that accuracy is visible in any of these portraits, because he was the artist who drew that view, produced a silver medal of the man. So he did get close to him at one point. And there we see the beard is still bushy, but it's granted those classicizing tendrils that are absent in the drawing and exaggerated even more in Bronzino's painting. The latter more effectively captures the imperious air of the persona, and more importantly, the office holder of a high military rank in Europe's major fleet. When displayed in Paolo Giovio's portrait collection soon after its production, Bronzino's canvas was accompanied by a Latin poem. In the English translation published just a month or so ago, the opening lines read, "This is Doria, with dishevelled beard and fierce trident, he holds dominion over the great sea." Well, notably, in the poem, the Latin poem, you can see that the beard is regarded as important as the trident, underlining the implied comparison with Neptune, god of the seas, and accentuating dominion over that realm. However, the Latin barba horrentum is rendered in English as dishevelled beard, whereas neither, I think, the poetic nor the pictorial context is descriptive. The Latin phrase that immediately follows refers to a fierce or furious trident, not a sharp or spiky one. And the two attributes convey the sense of imperial control. Furthermore, untidiness is just not worthy of a commander. Rather, the phrase means dreadful, fearful, horrible beard, akin to the use of the word terribilità by contemporaries for Michelangelo, referring to the quality of arousing awe and terror, of being fearsome. Such is the effect provoked by the beard of Michelangelo's Moses, one of the sculptures carved for the tomb of Pope Julius II, who referred to the sculptor as a uomo terribile, a terrible or terror-inducing man. Far from anxious responses to crisis or insecurity, beards such as these were assertions of ongoing patriarchal might, aristocratic privilege, and artistic imagination. Facial hair in early modern Europe was not all the same, but it was readable in social, medical, sexual, legal, and religious terms, being one way in which differences between men were visibly and proudly proclaimed. Thank you.